Hello and welcome back to the channel. This video is going to be part 2 of the Endgame series. In the last video, The Death of the Dollar, we talked about the exorbitant amounts of debt that have been built up in the world economy and how this debt is never going to nominally be paid back, with the only real way of paying this back is through inflation and through debasement. And the period that we are going to be going through of reducing this debt is the fourth turning. And so today we are going to be explaining and talking about the fourth turning and what it is likely to look like and what the likely changes are going to come from the fourth turning. So before we get into it today, guys, don't forget to like and subscribe and also to turn on post notifications so you don't miss any of my future videos. So the fourth turning was a book released by William Strauss and Neil Howe. In this book, they essentially explore history through the lens of cycles. And through studying history, they noticed that the cycles of history form a repeating pattern, much like the seasons and the cycles of nature. Now, bearing in mind that they wrote this book in the mid-1990s, and a lot of what they proposed and a lot of what they foretold has come true. In the book, they propose a cyclical explanation of history based on generational theory. So every 80 to 100 years, or about the span of one human life, also known as a saeculum, the seasons of history repeat themselves. They propose that history has a repeating pattern of particular events and particular moods and particular transformations that occur at the same point in each saeculum. So one saeculum, which is an 80 to 100 year period, comprises of 4 different turnings. The first turning, which is known as the high, the second turning, the awakening, the third turning, which is known as the unraveling, and the fourth turning, which is known as the crisis period. And each turning throughout history has had a particular mood attributed to that turning. So a first turning is an era of promise and belonging, a period where the old value regimes are decaying and a new civic order is being built. And then a first turning leads into a second turning, the awakening, which is an era of euphoria and defiance, where the civic order that was built in the first turning is attacked by the new values regime. And then a second turning leads to a third turning known as the unraveling, which is when the civic order that was attacked in the second turning begins to decay. And this is an era of separation and anxiety. And this leads into the fourth turning, which is the crisis, which is the era of survival and gathering. And this is where the civic order that was built in the first turning is at its lowest and at its weakest. But from this period of crisis, the new values regime is built and it propels the transformation of the civic order, which then leads into the next first turning where the new civic order is built and implemented. So along with this saeculum of history and the 4 turnings that it experiences, there are 4 different archetypes of generations during these turnings. And there's a quote by Napoleon Bonaparte which sort of explains where these archetypes come from, which is, "To understand the man, you have to know what was happening in the world when he was 20. And this basically means that when we are transitioning from childhood to adulthood, that is the period where we are the most influenced by the world around us and most likely to have our personalities set. And that is why each generation seems so different to the last generation, because the conditions at which these generations grew up are incredibly different. And so the mood at which you grow up in and transition from childhood into adulthood sets the archetype of what that generation will be. So the 4 different generations are the nomad, the hero, the artist, the prophet. And then after the prophet generation, you go back to the nomad generation. So the archetypes of the generations are determined really in which turning you were born in and which turning you came of age in. And each prior generation through history has had an archetype attached to it. So for example, the silent generation, who were born in 1925 to 1942, were the artists, and then the baby boom generation that came after were the prophets. Generation X were the nomads, the millennials are the heroes, and then Generation Z is going back to the artist. So each turning of history has a particular mood attributed to it. And the explanation for this is that during each turning, the different archetypes of generations are entering different stages of their lives. So for example, in a first turning, which is an upbeat era of strengthening institutions and weakening individualism, when a new civic order implants and the old values regime decays, the old prophets are dying out, the nomads are entering adulthood, the heroes are entering midlife, and the artists are entering young adulthood. And that is when the new next generation of prophets is being born. And the same is true for the second, third, and fourth turning, with their unique moods that they have. These moods are set by the archetypes and by the generations and by the actions of the previous generations, because each generation and each archetype has particular traits at different stages throughout their lives. While an archetype is made up of the majority of the generation, it is important to note that each generation will have outliers, and the archetype just describes the majority of that generation and the mood that that majority is able to set. And because that majority is big enough to be able to set a particular mood of that generation, that is how that particular turning is influenced. So you can see each turning has these archetypes at different stages in their lives. And this leads to very different feelings and very different moods and measurable differences between these points in the cycle. So for example, if we take social priority as the trait, in the high there is maximum community, in the awakening there is rising individualism, in the unraveling there is maximum individualism, and then during the crisis there is a rising sense of community. And these turnings have been studied to go all the way back to the late medieval period in Anglo-American history, with each major crisis in Anglo-American history going all the way back to the War of the Roses in England, but then more recently the American Revolution, the American Civil War, then the Great Depression and World War II, and the global financial crisis and the current fourth turning that we are in happen roughly 80 to 100 years apart. And these kind of major crisis turning events in world history, in Anglo-American history, happen around 80 to 100 years apart from each other. And that is because they always occur within a fourth turning. And the stage for that crisis is set because of the prior awakening and then unraveling as a result of that awakening. And you can never have, say, a third turning coming directly after a first turning. The turnings always come in cycles and one after another, just like the seasons of nature. And it kind of goes back to that age-old saying of hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and then weak men create hard times, and the cycle repeats. And now, while this is a very simplistic way to look at it, you know, this is a common saying which acknowledges that history has a cyclical sort of nature to it. So now we're going to look at the four most recent turnings that we have been through. So the first turning, which represents the spring of the season, or also known as the high, was in America after World War II. So in this first turning, you had strong, growing and strengthening institutions, you know, a kind of collective optimism, a certain conformity to the norm and to society's norms, and a high level of civic engagement and civic duty. And a high is a time of relatively high economic prosperity. Obviously not for everyone in the country, but for a large number of people, and this is where the emergence of the American middle class really came into being. And so the first American turning was known as the American High, which started with the end of World War II and ended with the assassination of JFK. So during this period, America experienced post-war prosperity with the rise of the middle class. They experienced institutional confidence with a high level of trust in government and institutions, and a high level of social conformity, as well as infrastructure development and civic participation. But then with the assassination of JFK, this leads us into the second turning, the season of summer, also known as the awakening. And the characteristics of the second turning are the spiritual and cultural renewal. And I say cultural renewal, but really this is a cultural crisis. The prophet generation, or the boomers, have grown up with the stifling conformity and feel like they have been put in a box by their parents, and they grew up in this sort of suffocating level of conformity where everyone is expected to just fit in and be the same. They come into adulthood questioning authority and really pushing against that collectivism and starting to introduce individualism. And they also rebel against the norm with social movements and also rebelling against the older generations. So this second turning in Anglo-American history is known as the Consciousness Revolution, and it began with the assassination of JFK and ended really with the election of Ronald Reagan as president. So this period was a period of huge cultural upheaval, you know, including counterculture, the sexual revolution, and the rise of new spirituality. And this was also the period where civil rights and protest and activism became extremely commonplace, with major strides being made in the civil rights movement, and also widespread protest against things like the Vietnam War, and also the birth of Greenpeace and Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and also a period of new music, art and literature that challenged conventional norms and also really made the older generations horrified at the questioning of the old norms. So this second turning really ended with the election of Ronald Reagan, and this leads us into the third turning, or the season of fall, which is also known as the unravelling. And during a third turning, these institutions that had been attacked by the previous generation are in decline, and individualism and cultural fragmentation is on the rise, along with rising economic disparities or rising wealth gap and a growing political polarisation. So Reagan and Thatcher really were the catalysts for the unravelling, with Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of the UK, famously having said that there is no such thing as society and the individual sits above it all. So the third turning in this era of Anglo-American history is known as the Culture Wars. And this really was the start of the growing political polarization that we see in politics today, and the start of the economic inequality that we are seeing. So, this period really was the rise of the yuppies, and the dog-eat-dog culture kind of emerged from this. And this is portrayed by Gordon Gekko in the film Wall Street, saying, "Greed is good." And this was also the start of the cultural fragmentation, or really the era of woke that we see in the Western world today, with politics having moved away from traditional politics and more towards identity politics on both the left and on the right. And this was also a period of declining trust in the government, media and other institutions, especially spurred on by the wars in the Middle East, which turned out to be under false pretense, and the increasing amount, or at least increasing visibility, of the corruption in these institutions. And this period in the unravelling was really where the breakdown of the social contract began in the Western world, with Margaret Thatcher taking a lot of the public institutions of the UK, like the railways and like the water companies and like public housing, and selling it off to private investors with all of their assets. And these companies are now likely going to have to be brought back by the British state, and they have been laden with a huge amount of debt, and they have essentially been picked clean by the shareholders. And it was also the beginning of deregulation in the US and the rise of the great debt bubble and the everything bubble that we have now. And it was also the beginning of the World Trade Organization, where Western workers are now competing against the global workforce, and the companies are able to profit from the cheap labour abroad and also profit from the relative wealth and affluence of the West, but while completely cutting out and arbitraging the cheap labour of the Eastern workforce against the labour of the Western workforce. And so, this idea of the social contract where everybody should pitch in and everybody should do the right thing towards society because it will create a better society really died in this era, and it became a dog-eat-dog world. And the wars in the Middle East contributed to a major decline in trust in these institutions, because these wars in the Middle East, while it was claimed they were for just and for righteous reasons, really these wars were to protect the petrodollar and ensured that oil continued to be sold in the dollar, which kept demand for the dollar and kept America as the global reserve currency and kept them having that exorbitant privilege of every other country needing dollars and needing to buy American debt. And the population starts to see that the institutions are really just corrupt and hypocritical. The wars that were claimed to be just wars are really wars for profit and for gain. And this leads us into the fourth turning, which is the winter, also known as the crisis period. And this is a quote from the Fourth Turning book. "The next fourth turning is due to begin shortly after the new millennia, midway through the00 decade. Around the year 2005, a sudden spark will catalyse a crisis mood." And that spark wasn't in 2005, it was 3 years later, in 2008, with the great financial crisis. So the characteristics of a fourth turning are institutional destruction, but then also renewal, collective action and increasing collaboration, and the reduction of the individualism that we saw in the previous two turnings. This is a period of leadership and sacrifice, and also of conflict and resolution. And through this period of crisis, we have a societal transformation. And this fourth turning is also known as the millennial crisis, and it was triggered in 2008 with the great financial crisis, and really the steady decline in living standards and in wealth of the general population since the 2008 financial crisis. And the other crisis points in this fourth turning have been the COVID-19 pandemic and also the war in Ukraine. And we are seeing the culmination of the widening divide that we have seen in politics, with more left-wing and more right-wing ideals and ideas gaining popularity in both Europe and in America. Now, nobody knows exactly when this fourth turning will end. Fourth turnings can either end with a great crisis event like World War II, or they can be more muted and sort of wimp out over a longer period of time. But regardless of how it does end, this will be a period of significant change and destruction of the old rules-based order system. This is also the period where the country is closest to civil war, with certain parties on both the left and the right believing that the other party, if they get in, will destroy their country, and therefore they have to fight in order to sustain and uphold the ideals of their country, and it is their duty to fight. So this is the period where we have been closest to a civil war since the last fourth turning. And on a global stage, this is also the period where we have been the closest to a peer-to-peer war between two great powers, for example, America and China, since the last Great War in World War II. Now, that's not to say that either of these things have to happen, but this is the period where we have been at the greatest risk of these things happening. And if either of these things did happen, then that more than likely would lead to the end of the fourth turning and usher in the new first turning of societal rebuilding and the revival of institutions. Now, there will be many institutions which are transformed through this period, but the institution that we are really interested in, and why you are likely watching this video, is the old institution of the money institution, and that really is around banks and central banks, because more than likely these institutions will either not survive this period or they will look very different after this period to how they looked before. And that is because these old institutions are not working for the majority of people, and the majority of people are becoming worse off because of the existence of these institutions. You know, one result of having banks and central banks, which also happened in the previous fourth turning, was the huge amount of private debt that was run up essentially by the bank, and they profited a huge amount from having this debt. But then when this debt inevitably did blow up and did become over levered, then the central banks stepped in and took the debt from these private institutions and made it public debt. So they basically socialized the debt. So the huge gains that these banks and individuals had been able to make during this run-up of private debt were able to be taken and kept by those individuals who made that money. But then the huge losses that should have been incurred by issuing this amount of debt and over leveraging to such a large degree, these losses have been socialized, meaning that everybody in the country who holds fiat money takes a share of these losses, all the while the gains were private and went to the individuals. So this essentially is socialism for the rich. It is privatized gains and socialized losses. And one thing I do want to talk about is the GameStop short squeeze that occurred in 2021. Now, a bit of history for those who don't know, GameStop was essentially being massively shorted by financial institutions, with over 100% of the float of GameStop being shorted, meaning that more shares had been shorted than actually existed in the system. And over time, momentum picked up into a huge short squeeze, where these institutions who had put on huge amounts of shorts at around $5 were now down thousands of percent, with the stock trading for above $100. And during this time, the traditional financial institutions such as Robinhood and such as Trading 212 and the traditional stockbrokers actually stopped people from buying shares and made it so that you could only sell shares and close your account, essentially putting an end to the short squeeze and bailing out these financial institutions who had once again massively over leveraged and put on more shorts than actually existed in the float, and who should have suffered the consequence of their risk as per the free market. They were actually saved and bailed out by these brokerage firms who stopped people from buying the stock. And this is just another example of how the traditional finance system is not working for the majority of people and is basically set up to favor the hyper rich. And this was also discussed in the previous episode, but the people who have benefited from debasement and from quantitative easing and money printing are the ultra rich. And the bottom 50% of people have barely benefited from this at all. And so once again, what this means is that those who are too poor to own assets are getting poorer at the expense of other people becoming richer. And it is a redistribution of wealth from the bottom 50% to the top echelons of society and to the asset holders of society. And the only way you can really get ahead or keep up is by owning assets. But owning assets, when measured against the debasement that is going on, are essentially flat and are essentially going sideways. So if you own the S&P 500, you are defending your wealth and you are retaining your wealth, but you are not generating any additional wealth. And this is the same for basically all traditional assets. So the S&P 500 or stock market is flat against the Fed balance sheet. The Case-Shiller index, or basically average housing prices, is actually down against the Fed balance sheet since 2008. So while houses have been going up in price, they have been losing value since 2008. And gold is another one that has also been losing value since 2008 when measured against the Fed balance sheet. Now, there are only two assets that have actually been beating the Fed balance sheet. One of those is the Nasdaq, or technology stocks, because technology stocks and technology companies are actually producing real wealth and real productivity in the economy and actually making our lives better and easier. And the other asset that has been outperforming this Fed balance sheet was the asset that was born in response to the 2008 financial crisis. So on January the 3rd, 2009, in response to the failures of the traditional financial system, cryptocurrency was born. And cryptocurrency essentially is the first alternative we have had to using the traditional financial system, such as banks and central banks. And cryptocurrency against the Fed balance sheet is also massively outperforming. So this is the total crypto market cap. And since 2014, it is up 18,000% against the Fed balance sheet. And, you know, many people still believe that this is a bubble and this is, you know, comparable to the tulip mania and that one day it is going to collapse and it is going to go to zero. But those of us who have been in the space and those of us who know what is going on and know that we are in a fourth turning, this is not a bubble. This is the migration from the old financial system to the new financial system and to the new institution. Although, you know, cryptocurrency is not really a traditional institution. It is a decentralized institution being run by nodes instead of being run by banks and central banks. So you have essentially this double-pronged attack where the debasement that is going on to the currency in response to the huge amount of debt that was built up over the past 40 to 50 years is essentially making everybody poorer unless you own assets. And it is essentially socialism for the rich. But when you look at all other assets are flat to down against the Fed balance sheet, and you are either defending your wealth or losing a small amount of wealth and losing a small amount of value by holding these assets. And the only asset that has really been able to generate a significant amount of wealth since 2008 is cryptocurrency. And so more and more people are starting to realize this, that the old system is not working for them and is not benefiting them anymore, and they are joining the migration to the new system. And you know, this isn't an instant process, it's a slow process as people realize what's going on and as people digest and as people come to understand that there is an alternative. And we are witnessing basically the fall of the dollar as the global reserve currency, just as has happened many times throughout history, you know, with the global reserve currency being with Spain and then the Netherlands and then France and then the UK and then through the most recent period with the USA. But we are going into the period of the birth of the next global reserve currency, or the next money of the world. And this really is the end of the big cycle, you know. So this is a graphic by Ray Dalio, who has studied the rise and fall of different empires. And they start with a period of peace and prosperity and productivity, and then go into a financial bubble and a big wealth gap, and then a financial bust, bust, an economic downturn, and then the printing of money and credit, which really is where we are now, and then going into a period of revolution and wars, and then debt and political restructuring, and then into the new world order. And this transition from the old monetary system to the new one is the greatest macro trend that has ever existed. You know, the migration to the new system will offer the biggest opportunity of our lifetimes. This is likely the greatest macro trend that has ever existed. And basically, the game here is to pick the winner of the monetary arms race and pick the form of money that has the biggest potential for value capture and the biggest chance for mass adoption in this next coming saeculum. Because as we get deeper into the fourth turning, this period that we are getting into, I refer to as the monetary arms race, where you have different forms of money competing for attention and for trust and for strength and for value, where you have fiat currencies which are propped up essentially by violence of the state and the laws that we create to prop these currencies up. And then you have these cryptocurrencies that are popping up, which are basically propped up by their technology and by their attributes of what money is and what money should do. And so the next episode of this series is going to be exploring what that monetary arms race is likely to look like and which asset is likely to be the winner of that monetary arms race, and why basically Casper is likely to be the winner of the monetary arms race, and why it is the fastest horse in the race, and what the attributes of Casper are make it likely to win this arms race, and what the attributes of these other forms of money provide attack vectors and make it likely that they do not experience adoption or do not retain their value because of the disadvantages people are put at when they use these forms of money. So make sure to stay tuned for that next episode, guys, and thank you very much for watching. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe, and again turn on notifications so you don't miss that next video. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, cheers.